Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another NetHope Solutions Center webinar. My name is Madeline No, and I'm with NetHope. And today we have part 4 in our AI Ethics webinar series. We're joined today by representatives from IBM, from Microsoft, and from NetHope. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping guidelines for our session today. Please keep this session interactive. Post your questions and your comments in the Zoom chat window for our discussion later in the session. Also look for a follow-up email with a link to the recording and collateral and links for more information from today's session on the NetHope Solutions Center. And at the end of our session today, we'll ask you to complete our short webinar satisfaction poll. Your input is very important to us, so please take a moment to fill out that poll. And with that, I will hand it off to my colleague Layla Toplik to start our presentation for today.
Thank you, Madeline. Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to the AI Ethics webinar series. So we'd love to know who's joined us for this session. We've seen some of the familiar names already, but please do say hello, share your organization, and also tell us where you're joining from, your country or city, and do that in the chat window, and thank you. Now, before I share what we have planned for this session, I'd like to introduce our featured speakers for today. And it is really my pleasure to welcome ethics experts from IBM and Microsoft to today's session. They both have impressive backgrounds, so I have to let you know in advance that this brief introduction I'll provide is only a subset of what Francesca and Steve have accomplished in their careers. Francesca Rossi is an IBM Fellow and the IBM AI Ethics Global Leader. She was a professor of computer science at the University of Padua for 20 years before joining IBM 5 years ago. Francesca is a member of the European Commission High-Level Expert Group on AI. She's also a member of the Executive Committee of the IEEE Global Initiative on Ethical Considerations on the Development of Autonomous and Intelligent Systems. She's the editor-in-chief of the Journal of AI Research, a member of the board of directors of the Partnership on AI, and she will be the president of the Worldwide Association of AI. Steve Sweetman leads customer and strategy for the ethics and society team at Microsoft. He has over 20 years of experience in the development of innovation practices with the focus on incorporating human-centered design and ethics into architecture. And in 2016, Steve started the governance and enablement of AI ethics in the Microsoft field. He joined Microsoft's AI Ethics Committee, Ether, and Steve will talk a bit about that later. And he helped author The Future Computed, where Microsoft's AI principles were first published. Steve has also helped establish Microsoft's Responsible AI Policy Office, or the Office of Responsible AI. And both Francesca and Steve have been actively involved in the nonprofit and humanitarian sector, supporting various causes. Welcome, Francesca and Steve, and thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
With that, thank you. With that, let me provide some context for the discussion that we'll have today, and also why we're talking about responsible organizational design in an AI ethics webinar series. Next slide, please, Madeline. So the focus in this webinar series, for those of you who've joined us over the past 2 months, is AI ethics, which is a field of ethics that has emerged quite recently, both as the pace of innovation in this space accelerated and also in a response to a whole set of issues that the AI systems might cause. And in the first 3 webinars in this series, we focus on how to design ethical AI solutions and programs. In part 1, we provided an introduction to ethics and also shared an example from the nonprofit sector of what can go wrong with AI and how to address the issues, and specifically the issues of bias. In part 2, we talked about some of the values that should guide responsible use of AI in practice and risks that might be encountered with respect to implementing machine learning and AI tools in accordance with those values. And then in part 3, just a few weeks ago, we explored ethical considerations, specifically the principle of fairness in machine learning projects. So really, in summary, so far we've been focusing on how we design an ethical, humane AI solution which for those of you who joined us for part one will remember that I defined that in the first webinar as a solution that supports individual and collective well-being and enhances our ability to tackle global challenges. Next slide, please. Now, the way we get to an ethical AI solution is through the process of responsible innovation. Some of you might be familiar with the slide from part one, where we define responsible innovation as a transparent, interactive, sustainable process by which organizations proactively evaluate how they can design and use technology in ways that are aligned with their values and missions. Essentially, ethical considerations in a specific AI solutions are also reflective of the ethical considerations of the environment of the organization. So when we develop AI solutions, teach machine to learn, we're embedding values from the surrounding social context and sometimes personal values in the choices we make about the design and use of the systems. So it really does matter whether the environment surrounding the solution, i.e. the organization, is ethical and responsible. Next slide, please. Now, so in order to have ethical AI solutions, which has been the focus of this webinar series, we need organizations that are developing and using these solutions to be ethical so they can provide the environment for the individuals and teams to make the decisions that are ethical and beneficial, and also ensure continuity and sustainability of responsible practices at the organizational level. And so this is why today, in part four, we will explore how ethical considerations are integrated into organizational culture and processes. Essentially, how do we design the whole system and culture to be ethical? Next slide, please. So at this point in time, we'd like to take a moment to hear from you. And thank you again for sharing where you're joining us from. So we'd like to hear from you what responsible innovation looks like at your organization today. Do you have broadly communicated ethical values and principles? Do you have internal ethics boards, teams, and committees? Do you provide internal ethics training for employees? Is there an incentive structure? Are there ethical principles incorporated into team and individual KPIs? Or are they embedded in hiring processes? Of course, this is really not meant to be an exhaustive list, so please feel free when we launch the poll to share other responsible design interventions in the chat window. So Madeline, let's go to the poll now. We'll give you another 10 seconds. Thank you so much for sharing what you currently have at your organizations in terms of responsible design interventions. Excellent. So let's close the poll. Great. Well, most of you, 81% of you, have broadly communicated ethical principles and frameworks. So let's go back to the slides. It's really not a surprise that most of you have ethical principles and frameworks. If we go to the next slide, you'll actually see some of them. So as I shared in part one of this webinar series, in the recent years, a number of organizations, including some of your organizations, have developed ethical principles and frameworks really as mechanisms to highlight important issues and to guide the design and use of technologies in a way that is ethically, socially, and environmentally responsible. So this data visualization from the Principles of Artificial Intelligence project by Berkman Klein's Cyber Law Clinic at Harvard University shows 36 prominent AI principles documents that have been created just in the last couple of years. I think it's worth noting that while the principles and frameworks can help us guide the design and use of technologies in a way that is responsible, they're only as effective as and impactful as an organization's ability to operationalize them across the whole system. So whether it's the teams you hire, what problems you choose to solve, how you design and implement solutions, who you partner with, who you sell to, and more. And what I keep hearing from global NGOs, NetHope members, is that connecting principles to practice can be quite challenging. And that is what today's session is about. How do we make sure that we not only have ethical principles and frameworks, but that they are supported by actions that drive their adoption and implementations. And we need to do that in the humanitarian sector because we cannot assume that organizations and people that work in the sector are inherently ethical and responsible, or that they know how to implement do no harm and other principles. We have to do that work to build ethical organizations. So hopefully this will be the first of many conversations that we'll have on this topic. Next slide, please. And we'll start this conversation with discussion on this topic with a conversation with technology companies. Companies like Microsoft and IBM, as you saw in the previous slide, have developed ethical principles and frameworks. Both Francesca and Steve will talk about that. They're also at the forefront of designing and using AI solutions and also working with our sector, with our NGOs. So it's not a surprise that many of you, based on the polls that we ran in May and June, really wanted to hear from the tech companies about their approach to responsible innovation and AI ethics. Next slide, please. So now I'll invite Francesca and Steve to provide a brief introduction to how each organization is approaching responsible innovation and AI ethics from the organizational perspective. I've asked them to cover examples of processes and tools, such as ethics boards, trainings, and toolkits, and also how these can work for an NGO. I've also asked them to share what are some of the practical examples and lessons learned, and also the resources that all of you could use. And we'll have all of these slides posted on the Solutions Center after the webinar. It's important to note that this will be a brief introduction. Each one of them could actually take a whole webinar to talk about all the work that these organizations are doing. And it's really meant to prompt you to ask questions and to guide what you'd like to explore in more detail. So do post your questions in the chat window, and we'll get to as many as possible during the later part of the session. Next slide, please. And just to note here, we actually already have several questions that have been pre-submitted by the NetHope AI Working Group. Organizations like the International Red Sea Committee, CRS, World Vision, the Carter Center, and others, and we'll come back to these questions and your questions after the presentation from Francesca and Steve. On to the next slide, please. So with that, I will hand it over to Francesca to talk about how IBM is approaching responsible innovation and AI ethics from the organizational perspective. Francesca, over to you.
Thank you, Leila. And good morning, everybody. So yes, I will give you a brief overview of the IBM approach to AI ethics within the company, and also in partnerships with many other stakeholders. Next slide. So first of all, definitely, I mean, I think that within IBM, but also I think in any company, this is all work in progress, where there is a path that we have been following with, of course, learning while taking this path for several years now. And overall, the path, if I try to summarize it, it started with very high-level principles, as you saw also as the result of the polls. I mean, it's somewhat the easiest part to get to the high-level, principles for responsible or ethical AI. But then, from the principles, we understood that they were not enough to have an impact on how the company was working and what kind of AI we were delivering to our clients. So we went down to more concrete levels to incarnate these principles into several dimensions of this idea of trust that we wanted to associate to the technology that we were developing and delivering. And then we also, I will give you more details about we also decided to help our designers and developers by putting together toolkits and educational material for them. And then, given also because IBM is a very large company and very distributed all over the world with many business units and so on, we felt the need for centralized governance that was useful for awareness, for scaling, for coordination, but also for enforcing some of these guidelines that we had put in place. And this same governance, whose main element is the internal AI ethics board, also defined processes for the various business units to follow to work in what we think is the responsible way. So next slide. So these are the principles that we published in 2017. We call them the principles of trust and transparency, and mainly, I mean, they say other things as well, but mainly, these are the three main pillars of these principles. So the first one is that we think that we want to deliver AI that is whose goal is not to replace human intelligence, but actually to augment and complement human intelligence, to help people make better decisions. And this is, of course, related to the IBM business model, where we usually deliver AI not to single individuals, but to other companies, like a hospital or a bank or a financial institution. So we deliver AI to companies, and their employers, their professionals are using this AI system. So we want to augment their own capabilities of making good decisions. The second principle is that about data. So data and the insights from the data belong to the creator, that do not belong to us, we are just handling the data, but we're not using or reusing the data from a client for another project, for another clients, and so on. And the third one is about transparency and explainability. So the technology must be transparent and explainable. So overall, we felt that this builds this system of trust around the technology. Next slide. So this is the same slide that Leila showed you. And it's just, the reason why I put it here is that yes, one can have these principles, but there are, I think at this point, so many lists of principles, and this project, in a very nice visual way, describe them all. And if you go to the website, you can zoom in, because it's impossible to read them at this size. And you can see that there are really a lot of different lists of principles given by several actors from the private sector, like IBM and Microsoft, but also intergovernmental, multi-stakeholder organization, governments, civil society, and so on. And they have things in common, of course. They are not, separate or completely different from each other. They have themes like human rights, human values, the responsibility, the human control, the fairness, of course, transparency and explainability, safety and security, accountability, price. So some of the themes are in common to most of this list. But the reason why I put it here is that yes, so now it's enough. We have enough principles, I think. And so we need to go beyond the principles. And so I'm very happy to see that the people in this call are interested in understanding how to go from principles to more concrete actions. So let's go to the next slide. So what we did to go to a more complete action, say, okay, our principles are focused on the idea of trust. But so let's try to spell out in more concrete and actionable terms, what does it mean for us to trust an AI system, to trust a decision or a recommendation made by a machine, besides accuracy. And we spelled it out into 4 dimensions. One is about fairness. So whether the machine can make decisions that may generate discrimination or not. So whether it includes bias in the data or in the other development processes, decisions, and so on. Second one is about explainability. The third one is about robustness. And the fourth one is about transparency, which also is essential for accountability. So these are the pillars. And so we started then, after defining the principles, then we defined these 4 pillars, then we started working in the various units, starting from research, and then taking some of what research was producing into the business units along these 4 pillars. Besides other things, of course, but in terms of responsible AI, those are the 4 lines of work that we started with. Next slide. So in terms of fairness, of course, we did a lot of work about algorithms to detect and mitigate bias in training data set. But then more generally, we decided that we wanted to be more comprehensive and about what are the possible technical solutions to attack bias and to make a machine more fair. And so we built and we published this open source toolkit called AI Fairness 360 that is available for everybody, where people can share code for algorithms to detect, mitigate bias, definitions of fairness, because there are many, many different definitions of fairness that are more or less appropriate depending on the context of the AI solution, or demos, or tutorials about fairness, or the training data sets, and one can try code and algorithms on the training data sets to understand what comes out after mitigating bias there. So in general, this is a way to build a community and to help developers understand what it means to tackle in a technical way this issue of bias. So the toolkit for us was very important, also because it was not just confined, within the IBM environment, but it was available for everybody, so with input from everybody as well. We also did the same, so research results, but also a toolkit, if you go to the next slide, also around explainability. So explainability is important, especially when one delivers AI in a context with very high-stake decisions or in a very regulated domain where it is necessary to provide explanations of why a certain decision is made. And even if the final decision maker is a human being, then this human being should be able to understand why a certain recommendation by a machine was made or not. So the second toolkit with the same ideas as the one about fairness is called the AI Explainability 360, and helps the developers understand how to tackle this issue. The next slide is about robustness. So we also have a similar toolbox for robustness. And if you go to the next slide, then we also did a lot of work about transparency. So transparency is less of a technical issue, meaning that is not that you is not a solution by AI, algorithms or toolkits, but it's very, very important because transparency by documenting the decisions that have been made or the results of the tests that have been made during the design and the development process allows developers themselves, but also clients, those that get the solution, but also governments, also regulators, also everybody, to understand what's the best, what's the most appropriate and non-appropriate use of the technology. So example of questions in this idea of the AI fact sheet that is at the center of our activities around transparency are here. So the intended use, the algorithms, what's to implement, some information about the test, information about bias, information about the explainability capabilities of the system, and so on. So many, many questions. And this is in line, for example, to another thing that was recently published by and actually will be published today by the high-level expert group on AI of the European Commission, which is called the self-assessment list. So this is also a list of questions that developers of a certain AI solution need to ask themselves and answer during the development phase, not at the end, but during, to to understand if they're really delivering AI with the responsible label or not. And the reason why it has to be these questions have to be answered not just at the end, but also since the start in all the phases of the development process, is because the answering to this question requires also to possibly to put in place new processes in order to be able to answer satisfactorily to a certain question. So that's why it's not possible to just have a checklist at the end, but it needs to be something that is in the mind of the developer since the start. Next slide. Okay, so here it said, okay, we have the principles, we have these 4 pillars, we work on research, we did the toolkits, we gave it to the developers and so on, but we said, okay, that's not enough. We need to put in place many other pieces of governance, of internal governance, to be able to really make sure that the whole company is on board and can share, and also that solutions in one of the business units can scale and be possibly adopted by other business units. So next slide. So again, these are the principles. So we know that already. So then on top of the principles, next slide, we built a lot of these pillars. So one is about policies and education. So for example, the last one here, so the AI fact sheet is one about policies, the data responsibility policy, the policy about face recognition, and also the recent commitment, to not deliver general purpose facial recognition. And then the last one here is Everyday Ethics for AI, is a booklet, an educational material that we gave to our developers to actually understand better these issues, whether it's explainability, transparency, fairness, because of course our developers need to be aware of possible, for example, bias that they can inject and where they can inject it in the various phases of the development. So the next thing is about research. So again, the trusted AI research area is around the 4 pillars that I already told you, and besides papers, of course, to conferences and so on, but also these toolkits that for us are part of the education of the developers. The next one is the business unit. And of course, we take things from the research unit and we bring it to the platforms that we use to deliver solution to our clients, like, for example, bias detection and mitigation algorithm, but also some explainability, forms of explainability. The next one is, of course, we have a lot of work also on social good, and we see that also as an educational component for the next generation, meaning that there is an internship program where PhD students or postdocs come to IBM for a whole summer to work mentored by IBMers on projects related to some of the sustainable development goals of the UN, with data and problem definition not given by IBM, but given by an external UN agency or a foundation or an NGO and so on. So that's, to us, is very, very important, as well as the PTech program to give the skills to the young generation around AI. And then the last one is about, the next slide, about partnerships. So we have many, many different partnerships. Some of them are at the scientific level, like the one with MIT, or the start of a new conference on AI ethics and society. But we also have partnership with many other companies, like, for example, together with Microsoft and 4 other main tech companies, we founded the partnership on AI in 2016. We were just 6 companies at the beginning, but now there are 100 partners, of which only 20 are companies, and all the other ones are all the other stakeholders that need to be in the discussion on how to define the best practice for beneficial AI. And in the context of the partnership on AI, we have projects where various partners participate. Some are profit, some are non-profit partners, of course, and we try to keep a balance also in each project. And of course, there is disagreement in the discussions in each of the projects that are carried on, and projects are very diverse. Some of them are about transparency, some of them are about fairness, others are about the use of AI in the judicial system, others about facial recognition. So very, very diverse, but there is disagreement, but the Partnership on AI, we coined this term, which is productive disagreement. So the collaborative environment in these projects and within the Partnership on AI is such that partners that if you take them one in a room would just argue with each other and not get to any constructive solution or agreement, in this context are really you can really see that they have a different attitude, much more collaborative. I don't know, I can think about, some IT companies relationship with the ACLU. I mean, that if you put these two entities in the same room by themselves, probably they will just argue with each other. But in the context of the Partnership on AI, they really are, everybody is very collaborative, and it's amazing to see the results that are. So it is an environment where collaboration really is the focus for every one of the partners. And then on top of these activities, if you go to the next slide, we put this AI governance centralized place, which is given by the AI Ethics Board. The AI Ethics Board is chaired by me and by the IBM Chief Privacy Officer, because of course privacy is a very important dimension of responsible AI development and deployment. But it has representatives of all the different units of the company, from research, from products, from policies, from legal, from communication and marketing, and so on. So, and the main goals and the main things that the AI Ethics Board is doing is, first of all, make all these business units aware of each other, work around AI ethics, and coordinate and align this to a unique and single point of view and single guidelines. And then to give a lot of advice and support to the business units. So every time a business unit wants to put together a new offering for a client that has some AI ethics considerations, then we should use a template that we give to the business units, respond to many questions, identify many features of that offering, and bring it to the attention to the board. The board altogether analyzes all these dimensions, all these features of the offerings, and then decides whether, of give general recommendation, but usually this is what is done, decides whether that offering makes sense and can be, put forward or not. And there are three main dimensions that I would say that are object of the vetting of the AI Ethics Board. One is the properties of the technology, such as fairness, explainability, transparency, and so on. So the properties of the technology have to be according to our guidelines. Second one is the uses of that technology that the client intends to do with that technology. And third one is the client itself. So all three dimensions, so whether the client has a reputation of being respectful of human rights and values that we care about or not. So I've seen solutions that were okay in terms of the technological properties, were okay in terms of the uses, but we did not want to deliver to a certain client because the client did not have a good history of respecting human rights. So, and that solution was not delivered. So those three dimensions are all equally important for us. And then, of course, the AI Ethics Board is also very important because it does not want to be just a top-down enforcing or policing entity within IBM, but it also wants to be a place where bottom-up initiatives, and there are many around AI ethics. It's amazing. Every day I receive emails about an IBM group that has new ideas and new projects about AI ethics. So we want really to be a place where the bottom-up initiatives can be aligned with the general point of view, but then also scaled to the level, of the whole company, rather than being confined in one single project, in one single geographical region. So go to the next slide. Okay, so that's basically my summary. Here I put again the first slide that I showed you, and I try to explain you, and again, that it's a work in progress. We have improved a lot over these very few years since the publication of our principles. Even the AI Ethics Board had some evolution over these years to make it more effective and more being able to make actual decisions that were followed within the company. But I'm sure that we will evolve even more in the following years. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Francesca. I think we're going to the resources slide next. Thank you for sharing how IBM is approaching responsible innovation and AI ethics, and we'll get into some of the questions a bit later. So hopefully this overview from Francesca has inspired some of the questions from the attendees. Please do share those in the chat window, and we'll make sure to share these resources on the webinar page. Thank you. And now we'll actually go to Steve from Microsoft. If we go to the next slide to talk about how Microsoft is approaching responsible innovation. Oh, let's go back. So how Microsoft is approaching responsible innovation and AI ethics from the organizational perspective. Steve, over to you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And what a great overview from Francesca as well. So thank you for that, Francesca. If you want to go to the next slide, I will start about talking about the foundations before we actually talk about our journey as a company on responsible and ethical AI, because I think that sometimes this can be overlooked, but is so critical to the success of these types of programs. First, we recognize that ethics is rooted in the culture and the values of an organization. And therefore, in order to go on a journey around AI ethics, you also need to think about your foundational culture. And for us at Microsoft, that's really been rooted in this notion of growth mindset, our ability to learn. And I really believe it's that growth mindset that has helped us as a company on this journey where there's so much uncertainty. There's so much unknown about the potential impact of new technology, which has human-like capabilities, which augments people's ability. And so we really need to enter this space with the willingness to learn and to adjust our approach. Secondly, that's actually our AI strategy as well. As a platform company, we have a strategy of trying to make AI available to everyone, to democratize its capability, whether that means embedding AI in applications that people receive, like Outlook and PowerPoint, or building the tools in which others can build their solutions on, like our cognitive services. But throughout that, we have this view of AI technology amplifying human ingenuity, meaning we want to put people at the center of the technical solution. And it's really that people-centered approach that guides a lot of our decisions around the impact of technology on people as well. So with that foundation, if you want to go to the next slide, I'll actually start the story of this journey from my own personal perspective. I was actually working in 2016 in our CTO organization. I was leading an innovation team as we were focusing on the adoption of AI technologies with our customers, and we're exploring what kind of value do these new capabilities bring. And specifically, we were focusing at the time on new breakthroughs in natural language understanding and processing, which helped customers build bots and conversational agents, when one of our research divisions launched an agent of our own called Tay. Now, if you were around in March 2016, you would have seen the headlines where Microsoft built the bot using new unsupervised learning techniques that actually automatically learned from conversations that were happening through social media. And it took less than 24 hours for some bad actors to figure that out and to begin poisoning the data streams that our Tay agent was learning from. And she went from being your friendly bot that was there to talk about the latest celebrity trends or the latest movies that were being released to being a very racist and hurtful bot. And we took her down. And that was a tipping point for me, but I think it was also a key moment for us as a company because we had been researching the socio-technical impacts of technology for over a decade out of our research organization, but it was suddenly no longer a topic of research. It was something that affected our lives and our customers' lives as well. And so with that, I started a journey in our company around establishing an AI ethics program first in our customer-facing organizations, our sales and our consulting group. And then later worked with Eric Horowitz and the team, and we established our central ethics committee that we called Ether at Microsoft. And I joined that committee representing our field organization. I'll talk about the functions of these groups in the next slide, but I'll really quickly kind of walk through that journey so you kind of see the progression. From the ethics committee, the first thing we actually did is to put in place some governance to recognize that there are uses of AI technology that have a broader impact on people and society than other uses. For example, the designer in PowerPoint could create some offensive recommendations, but the impact of that is different to the impact of a facial recognition system, which might be used by bad actors to suppress freedoms of assembly or freedoms of speech. And so we actually put in place a sensitive uses framework in our company. And that sensitive uses framework asks every person working on a project that falls into one of three categories to report to this committee to seek guidance. The first category is where it could deny a consequential service that someone receives. So think about any system which is involved in helping with financial lending or enrollment to education or enrollment to social services, where the impact of that is someone gets access to technology or they don't. That's the denial of consequential services category. The second category is where there could be a risk of harm. So any system that, for example, may be involved in healthcare, helping a doctor determine which patient to triage or treat or not, or make recommendations around that. As a result, someone may be injured or harmed, or an industrial safety application, which is there to keep people safe, but if it fails, an injury could occur. And the third category is where it could infringe on someone's human rights. And in particular, we think about the right to privacy, as well as freedom of association and freedom of speech, and really think about systems that could violate those fundamental rights. The next thing we did after listening to our customers and seeing about the real concerns and challenges that they were facing is we did publish our principles as well. And we published that in the book called The Future Computed. We published our 6 principles in early 2018. And since then, as Francesca showed and Leila showed, there's been an explosion of principles around the organization or around the world. And the good thing is a lot of these principles are very well aligned. So we're seeing some alignment there. In 2019, the next thing that we did, as well as establishing working groups around each of those principles to work on the topics of fairness, of transparency, of reliability and robustness, of security and privacy, we then established a central compliance office, a central policy office called our Office of Responsible AI. And this is really focused around the internal policy, our internal standard that we've established in the same way that we have a standard for privacy and we have a standard for security and a standard for accessibility. We now have a standard around the responsible development of AI, as well as external policy, working with regulators around topics like facial recognition, where we desperately need regulation. We need governments to step up and determine what appropriate uses are and not inappropriate uses are. And then we've been scaling that through our Responsible AI Champs program, and I'll talk about that more, which is really about getting the business involved at every level of the company in this responsible AI journey. So if you go to the next slide, as I said, we published these 6 principles, and again, they're very well aligned with IBM's principles, with many other principles across the industry. So I won't spend a lot of time in each one of these, but it is really important that we have these 7 principles, which are the foundation of our decisions that we make, which are all founded on our commitment also to human rights. Probably the one principle I will call out here, which is a little unique and is a little different if you look at all the frameworks around the world, is this principle of inclusiveness. And this really comes from that AI strategy of ours to augment and amplify human ingenuity. And what that means is that we want to be specifically deliberate about designing AI solutions for people that don't necessarily have access to technology, rather than creating a greater digital divide for individuals and for people as well. If you go to the next slide, though, I do want to spend a few moments and talk about the key functional roles we have in the organization. There are 4 of them here. The first one is our Ether Committee. And as I said, that was actually established first. It's chaired by Eric Horwitz, who's our chief scientist for the company, rolling up under our CTO, as well as co-sponsored and chaired by our chief legal officer and president, Brad Smith. And that committee is really an advisory committee that reports directly to the senior leadership team. That was first established around this function of defining our principles, but also being involved in providing advice around some of the most challenging questions that we have. Some of the questions like, should we build these solutions, or should we engage with these specific areas or customers on these types of projects? And so this committee is actually made up very much like the IBM committee. It's multidisciplinary representatives from every part of the company, rooted in our strong history of research, but also involving representatives from our sales organization, from our marketing organization, from our engineering organizations from across the company. Second, we have our Office of Responsible AI. And our Office of Responsible AI was established in 2019. It's led by Natasha Crampton, who's our Chief Responsible AI Officer. And it has 4 key functions. The first function of the Office of Responsible AI is to, as I said, work on our internal policy, to actually drive the development of our internal standards and develop those as our practices improve, to mandate things like reporting of sensitive uses, those categories that I talked about. The second thing that this does is actually now manages a central governance of every sensitive use. So we have visibility from across the company about where we are engaging in sensitive projects. There are times that we choose to take this on because the benefits outweigh the risks, but we want to do so in a thoughtful way with transparency across the organization. And so that central case management function is critical to that. The third is their central enablement function, driving things like training around our principles. So this year, in addition to our standard corporate compliance training that we have, every employee is doing training on responsible AI in the company, learning about our principles, learning about what they mean, and learning about what their requirements are under the standard in order to follow. And the fourth function is external policy, working with regulators, working with bodies like the European Commission that Francesca also talked about, working on that impact assessment that the European Commission is working on, working with the US regulators around the US position, as well as Singapore and as well as multinational bodies around the world on our regulatory positions with respect to AI, and advocating for better government laws and mandates that balance the needs for innovation and the needs for upholding human rights. And then we have the Ethics and Society team. This is the group that I'm part of. And we're really focused on enabling our developers within the company around responsible innovation. And this includes having a team of subject matter experts. We have ethicists on staff. We have user and societal impact researchers on staff. We have designers on staff who actually augment our engineering groups with expertise around human impact research and design to create experiences that truly embody trust, as well as developing the tools, developing toolkits like our fairness toolkit or our transparency toolkit, and some of our design guidelines and best practices that really help enable our internal developers with that journey. But perhaps there's no more critical function than our champs. If you want to go to the next slide. Our champs program, we actually started first in our global organization, where we asked every regional leader in the company to nominate a senior leader that reports to them to be a champion for responsible AI in their organization. And this started with a two-way opportunity. One was that we wanted to make sure that with our Central Ethics Committee, we have a global perspective, that we're thinking about how these issues manifest themselves in different geographies and about the socio-political context on which these concerns raise. At the same time, we wanted to make sure that in order for this responsible AI approach to be embraced by the business, that it was something that we actually have strong connection to every business leader in. And so around every region of the world, we have champs. And now we have champs in every area of the business as well. And today it's those champs that, again, they help raise awareness, they help their teams think about the ethical considerations of technology, they provide advice to their leaders, and they also help support the sensitive use process as well. And so with that, what I'll actually going to do is I'm going to go really, really quickly through the next 4 slides, which are primarily resources for you to take away, and then we'll open up to Q&A. But the key for us is that responsible AI, it is about thinking about the impact of technology, and it's more than that. It's really about saying that by confronting these concerns and these issues, we can actually create products, we can innovate in ways that inspire others. And for that, if you go to the next slide, we actually have a dual focus strategy. One is definitely around the data and the tools, and you'll see some of those toolkits here, but the other is around people and the practices that help us keep people at the center. And so if you go to the next slide, we actually published just a build just a few months ago, a couple of human-centered techniques. One is called harms modeling. It's part of our impact assessment technique that actually takes into considerations what the potential impact is of technology on people, a framework through thinking about those impacts, and also how you think about the types of people that are impacted. Who are the stakeholders, the minority groups, the vulnerable populations, those directly impacted as well as those indirectly impacted by technology. If you go to the next slide, we also published a human AI interactive guidelines. This is for designers to think about the user experience and how, when you're dealing with technologies, people need to think differently because these are now probabilistic systems. And so how do you communicate that clearly to people who are not used to interacting with probabilistic systems? And on the last slide, we also published a set of toolkits for data scientists and developers as well. Very similar to IBM's fairness and explainability toolkits, we have toolkits that actually help designers and developers with fairness assessments within their models and their data sets, as well as new types of models and interpretability techniques that help people explain and understand what these very complex systems are doing. And all the resources are here for you. So with that, I'll hand back over to you, Leila, for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. In fact, both you and Francesca have proactively answered some of the questions that we've had from our AI working group members. Really excellent overviews. And do let us know, those of you who've been listening to these presentations, if you found this helpful for your work and what specifically has resonated with you, like if there are any specific interventions that you've heard about, whether it's the ethics boards or toolkits, trainings that you think is helpful for your work. So with that, what we'll actually do, we've skipped one of the polls so we can get to as many questions as possible. The first question, and I'm going to ask Francesca and Steve to keep it relatively brief, and we can have a follow-up discussion after the webinar through email. First, both Microsoft and IBM are large multinational organizations, and so are a number of the global NGOs that are part of this call. And they're interested in hearing from you how you implement responsible innovation at a large organization across many geographies and many cultures. And how would you do that on a shoestring? So very limited resources that NGOs have. So I'm going to actually go to Steve first and then Francesca.
Yes, and so I'll reiterate, one of the key functions that we talked about which is this CHAMPS program. And it is a program, meaning these are not, even at Microsoft, these are not dedicated full-time staff roles, but these are people who have a passion for AI ethics, but also are respected by their leaders. And like I said, we started with that actually at a global perspective. So we have a champ in every geography in the world to really create that connection with our central ethics committee out to these regional groups. The second thing I'll also mention is we also have a very strong community presence internally. So these are self-serve, bottoms-up communities that anybody can be part of, where they can engage in the dialogue, engage in the conversation, because we say so much about ethics is actually talking about the impact. It's not about having the answer of is this right or is this wrong, but it's about raising the conversation. And so having a strong community supported by those champs is also critical.
Thank you, Steve. Francesca, your thoughts on
yes.
this question?
Yeah, so we have well, first of all, we have in every unit, whether it's research, communication, the various business units, and so on, we have it's called an AI ethics focal point that with the goal of communicating between that unit and the AI ethics board in the two directions. No? So getting information, guidelines, templates, whatever from the AI ethics board and bring it to that unit, and also bringing from the unit, you know, the possible new offerings and so on to the AI ethics board. Or new initiatives around AI ethics. And we have a regular, you know, meeting of all the AI focal points with the chairs of the AI ethics board to really educate them and make them aware. We also have an internal website for the AI ethics board and all the activities that are that have been spawned internally, and all the use cases that have been approved or not, you know, and so on, all the guidelines. And so that helps, you know, bringing, disseminating the guidelines and the tools to use to the various business unit. So that for now, it seems like it's working. I mean, even though there are really a lot of bottom-up initiatives, as I mentioned, that that are within business units and that are then communicated to these AI ethics focal points to be brought up. But I mean, that's a path that that probably will evolve and will in the future as well.
Great, thank you for sharing that. Just a quick follow-up question from Mark, and I'll ask you to just select one technique that you have found useful for training and explaining AI ethics to non-technical team members. Francesca, what would be that one technique for non-technical team members?
Well, we put together webinars on AI ethics and some specifically on fairness, for example, and we deliver that to all the country general managers, for example, that these are distributed geographically in every country in the world where there is an IBM office. But so those are, you know, a high level, you know, executives that are not necessarily technical people, but that was our way also to convey our guidelines, our tools, our solutions to the single regions of the world.
Great. Steve, one technique.
Yeah, so I'll actually talk about a game that we released in May. I'll put the link here in the window for it as well, called Judgment Call. And this is a game that we'll play with people who are new to the topic and really helps them engage in the conversation in a non-confrontational manner. It allows them to think about a scenario, think about people that are impacted, and then they're given a principle and they're given a rating, like an Amazon product rating that they have to write about that experience. And so it could be a bad rating, a 1 out of 5, or it could be a great rating, 5 out of 5. And then they have to think about, why would someone, if the topic is fairness and they're given a 1-star rating, why would they have a bad experience? Or if the topic is you know, transparency and they're given a 5-star rating, so they're able to understand and explain it, why would they do that? And it's a great way to have people engage in a fun manner around this topic, and it's been a really effective tool for us as well.
Great, thank you. And a final question, as we're running out of time. Partnerships is key to the adoption of AI in our sector, and it's one of the areas that you talked about. So just if you can give a couple of examples of how you would go about applying AI ethics when working in partnerships, especially when there's a power imbalance, for example, between nonprofit organizations and funding organizations or technical experts, kind of one piece of advice of how to do that. Steve, let's go to you, and then Francesca.
Yeah, and I think Francesca already did a great job about talking about the partnership that we're both part of, the partnership on AI. And I think that is a great example of this, where we really see that, you know, even though we're a big tech company, we actually rely strongly on the ecosystem. We rely strongly on all of our partners to implement our technology and to use it in a responsible way. And really that needs to come together by engaging jointly in joint partnerships like the partnership in AI that Francesca talked about. But the other thing that I'll really talk about is around education and transparency. So the other thing that we've done to help our partners is we create a lot of education as well as the game. I talked about, we launched the AI Business School where there are modules on responsible AI in every industry that our partners represent so they can be educated on the topic as well. And then secondly, we've got a commitment to transparency, which means documenting both what works, but also what doesn't work when it comes to these technologies, and releasing things like code of conducts and terms of use that actually not just for using our technology, but for our partners to use when they implement technology. And so it's through that documentation as well as education that we can actually partner with our partners and enable them to take a responsible approach as well.
Thank you, Steve. Francesca, anything else to add? You already covered quite a bit in your introduction on partnerships.
Yeah, well, specifically, maybe something that is also important to understand that the partnership on AI, it has been, so for example, the board of directors of the partnership on AI that was funded by 6 companies has 12 members. 6 are representing the 6 founding companies, among which IBM, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Google and so on, but the other 6 come from non-for-profit organizations. And so that was really a big commitment to make the main decision-making body, strategic decision-making body, to really be balanced. And we want, every project, we try to make it balanced as well. And then I agree with Steve that the learning part is very important. In every project, I feel that the non-technical and maybe non-tech stakeholders, they learned from us, but also we learned from them, and that shows in the result, which usually can be a white paper or a paper, even a paper describing a certain topic and so on. So definitely I see a lot of learning being done within each project because of this balance between the tech companies and the other stakeholders.
Thank you very much. Well, huge thanks to Francesca and Steve for sharing how IBM and Microsoft are approaching responsible innovation and AI ethics. We will share all the fantastic resources that you put in the slides with everyone. And do let us know, so that's for the attendees who've stayed with us for extra 3 minutes, let us know if you'd like to have additional conversations on this topic, either in a webinar format or in a workshop format. Thank you all for joining us today. Over to you, Madeline.
Thank you, Leila, and thank you to Francesca and Steve as well. Thanks for attending today's session. Please take a moment to complete our webinar satisfaction poll and give us that input that Leila was asking for and any other ideas you have to make these webinars better for you and better for our community. Do look out for the follow-up email that will contain a link to the recording for this session as well as all those other resources that we mentioned. I am Madeline No with NetHope, and we want you to have a great rest of your day. Thank you.